Hey everyone, welcome back for Roost 104 Options Generators and Generic API Requests. This course will be delivered by Tim Fournette and will cover topics like workflow option generators, generic API requests, and using the Jinja live editor to add some Jinja into your workflows. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind everyone that you don't have to go at it alone. We have our Discord channel where you can get help on the fly from our Rock team. We have docs at roost.help. You can create tickets, come to our Rock open mic on Fridays, and of course, go to calendly.com/clucku to sign up for any other courses we have available. For more details, check out the description below. And without further ado, take it away, Tim.
All right, let's go ahead and start. Again, this is our Roost 104 session. What we will do today is take the workflow that we built in 102 and make it a little bit better. We're going to introduce workflow option generators to a form. We're going to do some stuff with generic API requests to Microsoft, do a little bit more with the Jinja live editor, talk about list comprehension a little bit. If you joined the 103 session, then you'll have seen some of this already. Now we're going to put it into actual use. We're going to evolve our workflow a little bit. So remember, with building workflows, with doing automation, the best way to do it is to start with something simple, make sure you can get it working, then make it better over time. So in the first session, we just did something simple that adds or removes users from a group. Now we're going to come back and iterate over that, make it a little bit better by only showing the groups in the form that we're interested in seeing. So for example, if we're trying to add someone to a group, you don't want to necessarily list the groups that they're already a member of in the list. That would be redundant and would result in errors when we run the workflow. If we want to remove someone from a group, then we don't want to see groups that they are not a member of. So we'll talk about how to do that. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to pull up the form that we created last time. I'll actually go to forms and search for it by date. So we have our form for adding and removing group membership. So let's look at it for a minute. We're listing users, which is what we're going to do. We're listing these directly from Microsoft Graph using dynamic options. We're also listing groups from Graph using dynamic options, but this is listing every security group, paying no attention to what the users already are not a member of. And again, we have our action to add or remove. So we're going to make one adjustment here. We're going to convert this to a workflow generated option generator. And knowing that the options that we pass into the group list will depend on whether we're adding or removing, from the group, I'm going to go ahead and move this above here because it'll make more sense to pass in the decision that we're making first. So let me save this just for now. And what we're going to do is create a new workflow. So I'm going to open up workflows in a new tab. All right. And I'll give this a name. I'm going to do the same thing, give it a name by the date. So we'll call this option generator for groups based on user membership. Long name it whatever you want. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to set some of the variables up for this workflow. So we talked about last time, maybe the workflow types. This one will be a workflow type of option generator. So this is going to change the way the workflow works a little bit. It's going to make it show up in the form editor as an option generator workflow. So it'll be choosable there. And also, whenever we build option generator workflows, it's going to expect a specific variable to be set as an output variable. So output variables are variables that are kind of or output along with the workflow. So if you use a workflow as a sub workflow, you may create certain output variables that are going to be the results of the actions that took place within that workflow. And if you're going to use it as an option generator, we're going to expect a variable created that's going to be called options. And it specifically needs to be called options in this case. What we'll do is we'll pass a context variable in here, but we don't know what that's going to be yet. So I'm just going to put this as CTX, that's something, and we'll come back to this. Just like the main workflow here, we also need some input variables. So we're going to generate a list of things based on whether or not we're adding or removing the user from the group. So we're going to go ahead and recreate the action variable. I'm going to set this as required. And we also need to know the user ID of the person in question, because that's going to help us determine the action, the output that we're going to send. So I'm going to also set this to be required. And just like the regular workflow, we're going to need a no-op that is going to help us determine in the workflow if we're adding or removing the user from the group. So I'm going to create this just like I did in our workflow we created. So I'm going to create a no-op called add or remove. The first option will be add. The condition for this option will be if cpx.action equals the word add. Again, when we're doing evaluations or comparisons in Jinja, we use a double equal to show that we're doing a comparison. Single equals mean a set command. So we're going to create an add condition as well as a remove condition. So here we want to list groups that the user may be already in, or we list groups that they're not in. So listing groups that someone's not in is, not a call we're going to make directly. So we're going to need to figure out how to do that. But I know how to list users groups that a user is in, because there is a Microsoft Graph call for that. But if I look in the Roost actions for Microsoft Graph, I'll just do a search here for groups and see that I have list groups, list security enabled groups, list mail enabled groups. But if I look at this isn't necessarily listing groups that a user is a member of. So what we would typically do here is use a generic request to graph. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to search for the word graph because I know that the Microsoft Graph generic API request is called Graph API request. But then what we often find ourselves doing is going to go to the old Googles and ask it, how do I find Graph API call list groups a user is a member of? And I can find that there is a special endpoint called users / the ID or user principal name of a user / member of. So I can use this. I'll copy this here. Also see that it is a get action. So I will go to this generic API request. First thing I'll do is I'll give it a name, because I don't just want to call it this. I'm going to call this graph, or let's see, I'll call this list user groups, because we're going to list the groups that the user is a member of. Our API base URL, so we can look at this and see that the base URL is not going to be a beta URL or anything like that. So we'll stick with, in fact, I can scroll here and see that this is a 1.0 URL request. So I can leave this at 1.0. Sometimes you find things that only exist in the beta API, and you may have to change the 1.0 to a beta. But the endpoint, go ahead and paste this in. Obviously, we don't want to keep this. What we're going to do is replace their documented field here with our Jinja evaluation. So we're going to use cpx.user ID. So now the full URL will be graph.microsoft.com/v1.0/users/ the user ID /member of. I'll close this. The rest of these fields we can leave as they are. Also wanted to change this action to a follow first for good practice. and voila, connect that here. So we're getting a list of the groups that the user is a member of. We're going to need to set this to a variable. So let's look at the results of what they look like. So if I look at the documentation from Microsoft, I see that we're going to get a value for Microsoft that will be a list of groups. Very similar to what we get whenever we're just listing groups in general. So we do not get automatic autocomplete based on endpoint in our evaluations, obviously for generic API requests, but we do get them for things like list group. So if I were to look at list groups, and this is listing all the groups, let's go ahead and just set this to list all groups. And I will see what we get for an evaluation here. So I'm going to create a data alias here. So data aliases are ways of setting variables at the end of a workflow or a task execution. So when this task is successful, because the on success condition is selected here, we can set a data alias. And within the data alias, we can refer back to the results of that task. We can do that with the word result. So I can, and then let it autocomplete. So I have a result dot lowercase result, autocomplete all the way down. So I'm interested in the data here and then the value. I can keep going down here and see the values of every, the fields that are going to be in every group that it gets returned, but I don't need that. I just want the entire list of groups. So I'm going to copy this. And I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to create a data alias. I'm going to call this group list. And since the data format's the same, I'm just going to paste in this and notice that the same values will work. So I have a way of getting all the groups. I have a way of getting the groups that a user is a member of. But how do I get a list of the groups that a user is not a member of? So it turns out what I can do is I can subtract, this list from this list, and then that would give me all the groups that is not one of the groups that the user is a member of. So let's figure out how we do that. So I'm going to leave this, I'm going to list all the groups first, because what I want to do is show you guys in the live editor how we see all this data. So I'm going to publish this and show you how we can kind of iterate over this a little bit simpler. So I've created a option generator. I'm going to add a trigger to this. We always need to put a trigger on a workflow when we're going to use it as an option generator. So I'm going to just give this a name as option generator. I'm going to enable this. My trigger type doesn't really matter here. I could put form, but I'm not really, this isn't a form trigger because we're not attaching a form to it to run the workflow. So usually what we use here is the always pass. Integration overrides still apply since we are doing Microsoft Graph queries. We're going to choose Microsoft Graph. I could select this for all more organizations. Typically would if I were an MSP, but in a test environment, I don't need to. So let me submit this. I'm going to save my workflow. I'm going to reload my form because it needs to know when a page loads, it needs to list all the workflows and know about which ones exist. So I'm going to reload the form, and we're going to go to the group selector and convert this from a non-workflow generated option generator to a workflow generated option generator. So when you do this, you'll have a selection drop down, and this again will list all of the workflows that are option generators for your company. So I'm going to select the one I just created, option generator for groups. We have a name and value field here. I know that The option generator is going to create a list of groups, and each group will have its ID. And for the label, Microsoft uses display name typically, so I'm going to use that here. Default selected field we can use if there is a certain type of option generator that we might return an option that we want to default to. In this case, I don't want to do that. The trigger, I will select option generator. And we notice here that since we have input variables on that option generator, we have fields to correspond to those in the form editor. And the cool thing about this is I can use data that is populated from the form fields themselves to pass into that option generator. So I'm going to do that. This is going to be the action field. So I'm going to populate this from the action variable, leave this as required. And I'm going to do the same thing for the user ID field. So this will be populate from form field, and we'll select user ID, and we'll save this. Now I want to actually run this form to pull the option generator, so I'm going to click the View Usages button here. View Usages will show you all the workflows that use this form as a trigger. So if I click on View Direct URLs, I see that here's our workflow trigger that uses this form. So I'm going to open this in a new tab, flip to that tab, and select a user. So I'm going to select Mr. Dumbledore here. I'm going to select Add. And notice that when I selected it, it actually ran. I don't know if you noticed the little circle start to spin, and it didn't work out properly because we haven't finished our workflow, but that's no big deal. I'm also going to run the remove operation, and then I can see that it ran the workflow. So I can go back to my option generator and click on View Results for Workflow, let that open in a new tab. Probably failed because I didn't, make it complete yet. No big deal. It's going to fail because I didn't properly create the output variable. But what I'm interested in is the variables that were created. So I have a group list, which remember was the list of groups that the user is a member of. Right now they're only a member of one group, but we see that in the group list. And I have an all groups list that is, remember, all of our Azure AD groups. So what I can do here is I really want to end up with a Jinja statement that will list all of the groups that the user is not a member of. So if I think about how logically I want that to work, I want to list all of the groups that do not contain groups from the group list. So I can click this little button here, this open context button, and this will open the context that we had from the workflow execution. So we have a JSON object up here that is all of the data that was in here in these context variables, including the inputs and all the environment variables. What this lets me do is I can write a Jinja statement that would basically refer to all the data that existed in the workflow when the workflow completed, even if it failed. So if I were to do something like cpx.user.username right here, I can see, I know I should see a user.username, and there it is. Here's my username. I can do ctx.allgroups and see all of the groups. So there's 27 objects in that list. So now what I can do is some list comprehension. So what I'll do is open up a Jinja statement. I like to spread things out amongst multiple lines when they're more complicated than just a single thing to say or do. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to create an expression using list comprehension. Those begin with square brackets. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to let the editor automatically tab that over for me too. And then what I want to do is I want to list, I want to cycle over the groups in all groups. So I'm going to type in for group in ctx at all groups. So what I can do here is if I just did the group for group in CTX at all groups, I get the exact same result because it's basically, I'm going to output, I'm going to loop over all the groups. And for each one, I'm just going to output that group. So, we're not doing anything special here. I could do filters here just to show you. So I could type in group.id. Then I would have a list of all the IDs from that list and see that we have all the IDs. I could do the display names. So I can see all the display names of all my groups. But what I want to do is filter these. So I can do something like I want the entire group object and say if the group is not in CTX dot group list was the list of groups that the user is a member of. So if I run this, I get all these groups, and since the user is a member of one of the groups, scroll down and see that there's all groups not in here. I bet all groups is a special, or all users is a special thing that doesn't show up. So I'm gonna try this with another user that is, we'll come back to it as I'll run through and add the user to some groups at the end of it. But what we have is I can list all of our groups. So I can put this here. I can list the user groups. So there's a couple of ways I can build this workflow. I could, since I'm interested in all the groups, I could do this here, list the user groups. Since I'll be doing this every time, I could do it this way. Or I could copy this action. So I could right click on it or click the little ellipses here, create a copy, move it down here, and link it this way. These are functionally the same thing because we're just running the same action in two different cases. However you want to build the workflow is the right way to do it. So it can be done either way. But what I can do here is, so I have my all groups, I have my group list, and I can add a no-op to generate that list. So in this case, I'm going to call this, instead of group list, I'm going to call this user groups. I don't reuse the same variable here. Not that it would hurt anything, but it would be confusing to troubleshoot later. I'll call this compile group list. And I'm going to do this in a no-op separately from this action. I could just create another data alias here, but again, it's easier for troubleshooting and for maintaining your workflows later if you use different actions, no-ops, to separate some of your logic from your actions. If I were ever to want to reorganize things, it makes it a lot easier to move stuff around. So I'll create a version of group list here. I'm going to paste in that Jinja statement that I created. My context variable here is going to be user groups. Again, we're going to get a list of all the groups from all groups, but only if each of those groups is not in the user groups object. So I'll close that. Notice that in our workflow, the last actions transitions from each one is creating a data alias called group list. And that group list will be suitable for us to use in our option generator. So I'm going to go back to our variable configuration. And since I chose to use group list for the name of that variable, I'm going to put that in here. Now if I hit submit, publish my workflow, go back to my form, reload the form, and let's select this first user. I'm going to add into some groups. And this may fail because we're Azure AD synced, and some of these may be local AD groups. So I'm going to add them to a few groups. And now if I choose him and choose remove, let's see if any show up. Yep. So some of these were not Azure AD synced. So now whenever I select this user and select remove, I see that I'm only listing groups that they are a member of. So if I choose add, I should not see Allen Test 1 or a rock call group. Let's add them to some more groups. Oh, yep, I have multiple Allen Test 1s, obviously. Let's try this one. The forms do cache data, and so if you want to make sure you get fresh data each time, you hit the little refresh button here. So yeah, is MTC billing service accounts, whatever that means. So if I go to add the user to the group, make sure I refresh the data, and it still shows up. Let's take a look and see why. So go back to the option generator. Yes, my group list is still getting all these groups. I'm going to bet that the objects are not the same. Yep, so I imagine what's happening here is these objects are not exactly the same. So Microsoft might be returning the data differently. So what we'll do is we'll make an adjustment to our option generator. Rather than comparing the entire objects together, we're going to compare just based on the group ID. So we can go to our Jinja editor, and we'll use this again. Do I still have it in my contact? Yep, I sure do. So if I run this, I see that I probably still get 27 results. Oh, user groups. So what this is doing is comparing all the group objects together. And if the group objects are, maybe they got different attributes or they're showing things up in different ways, but the IDs we know are unique and something that we can easily compare. So what I'll do here is we'll do an embedded list comprehension here. So what I can do is make sure that the group.id is not in another list that we're going to create. That's going to be user group.id for user group in ctx.usergroups. So what this is doing is we're going to make a list here that's going to be like a sublist of just the IDs of the user groups from the user groups. So now if I run this, shrink, minimize this down there. So now I only have 23 groups. So that's way better. So we're going to update this option generator with this extra logic. Publish that. Now, if I pull up the form, refresh, now I see that the service accounts group is gone. We have a shorter list, but you know what? We can make this better. This list is kind of hodgepodge. It's probably ordered by the creation date of the group. Let's make that alphabetical. Let's go to our compile group list here. We can use a sort filter here and for Jinja. So I'm going to use sort. Now, sorting on objects means that we need to define which attribute of the object we're going to sort by. So I'm going to pass in for parameter for sort attribute equals display name, since that's what we're showing. And I want to do that not only for the add side, but also the remove side. So can pass that here too with our type character, which is how we pass things to a filter. So now if I publish this, go back to this, refresh our results, pull it down, and now we're sorted alphabetically. If I click on remove, should see just the groups that the user is a member of. So if I remove them from Allen test 1, hit submit. Notice that we didn't change the actual workflow that does the thing. All we changed was the way that we generate options that get pushed to it. So if I go to that workflow, see that I haven't changed it today. Still looks exactly the same. I can pull up the results and see the actions that we did today. So this one we just ran was a remove action. I removed that user from that group.
Thanks, Tim. Before everyone goes, we just wanted to remind you of some additional helpful resources that you have access to, including Roost help docs, official Jinja documentation, ChatGPT, of course, and others. So feel free to take a look. And as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.